Well, thank you very much. This is really exciting. The turnout is amazing. We really appreciate it. Our book on the breeding birds in Minnesota came out about a year ago, and we had a big celebration down in the cities. And Jerry and I have been traveling across the state giving a lot of talks during this past year. And this is the last one on our agenda, and you are doing it in style. This is really, really exciting. We really appreciate it. How many of you read the book? Okay, maybe he has. I'm glad. Way to go. Well, we're going to divvy up this presentation, and I'm going to start out. So really first of all, thank you very much for including us and inviting us. And Lacey, thank you very much for organizing all this. And I'm amazed that you guys get together every week to do this. It's just really impressive. And we hope you do learn a few things about Minnesota birds in the process. Can you hear? I need to stay closer to the mic. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that cue. As I said, we started this journey about a year ago. The journey to talk about the book took much longer. And what I want to do is just start out and talk. There's actually 3 authors involved. And Jerry is the first one. And as Lacey mentioned, he's from the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He not only made major contributions to the book, but he designed and managed the collection of data on birds from what we call point counts, which we're going to talk about later. Point counts is one of the 4 main methods we use to collect data on Minnesota birds. So we'll get into that in more detail. And then Jan Green, which I imagine if you haven't met her, you know her name. Jan is a longtime resident, and her husband in Duluth, written hundreds of publications on Minnesota birds. She was our atlas coordinator in the Northeast Minnesota, and then really focused on accounts for very historical species. She just turned 90 this summer, so she's quite a legend. And then myself, I was coordinator of the atlas in the metro region, did a lot of contributions, books, and I also kind of managed the whole publication, which led to a lot of frustrating moments. It had nothing to do with birds, just with publishing. Well, our journey began quite some time ago, and it began with what we call the Minnesota breeding. This book really focuses on that data, but it adds a lot more information. So what we're going to cover today is briefly some background about what the atlas does and how it's implemented. Very briefly about how we analyze and summarize the data. More briefly, the book preparation, and then we'll spend a lot more time on the highlights and what's in the book. Now, for those of you who are birds, you know that we have a lot of references in Minnesota about Minnesota birds, a lot. And this is just a small sample. So I think it's a fair question to say, why do we need anything else? And we had several major goals for the breeding bird. First was we really wanted to document and update the status and locations of all the birds that breed in Minnesota. That doesn't include migrants that move on elsewhere. It doesn't include winter residents from Canada itself, just those that breed. And we want to do it at a much finer scale than has ever been done in the past. You know, telling you that a bird lives in St. Louis County isn't real helpful, is it? It's a huge county, bigger than some of our eastern states. So having more precise information is really helpful from an environmental standpoint and a conservation standpoint. We also wanted to identify the distribution of suitable habitat for those breeding species, estimate the population size of those birds with more detail than has been done in the past, and then summarize all that information in a website that we'll briefly talk about, and a book that really maximized the dissemination of what we learned to everybody here in the audience and throughout the state. So it always helps, I think, to begin with an example. And this is a little bird, one of my favorites, a really tiny little sparrow with a very tiny little voice called LeConte sparrow. And it occurs primarily in wet grasslands in the northern part of the state. We first knew about this species in 1892 because Dr. Philo Hatch was the first one who really wrote a comprehensive account of the birds that he knew or that occurred in Minnesota. Now, Dr. Hatch's books has a lot of problems because a lot of his information was hearsay, but it's still a really valuable resource. And when you consider the date, it's really important. And this is what he wrote about the LeConte sparrow. And he didn't have a map, it was just a writing. And he wrote, this bunting, which is also called, breeds considerably in favorable localities in a large part of the state. And I have out as of the late years that has become observed to be in the breeding season in these actually southern counties, Grant, Big Stone, and Freeborn, that are southern and central Minnesota. So this was his account. When you think about it, you say, well, that's a pretty widely distributed bird. Probably occurs in a lot of places. Well, the most important publication on Minnesota birds was in 1932 by Thomas Roberts, who was also a medical doctor in Minneapolis. And he was really quite the ornithologist from a very young age. His family moved from Ohio, I believe, to Minnesota. And he and his father were really into birds. And after his medical career, he actually was the founder or the first director of the Bell Museum of Natural History down in Minneapolis, if you know about it. Well, he wrote a 2-volume book that's just still today kind of the seminal publication on Minnesota birds. And he wrote of the LeConte sparrow. It's a summer resident throughout the prairie and open woodland portions of the state, and is apparently most abundant in the Red River Valley. So you're getting a little bit more information from his account, because he was as an ornithologist, he was far more traveled with a lot more field experience than Dr. Hatch was. And you kind of get the idea that, oh, it's abundant maybe everywhere, but most abundant in the Red River Valley. Well, it wasn't actually until 1975 that we first had a book that showed the distribution of birds on a map, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, because it really wasn't that long ago for those of us who are in their 70s. And this book was by Jan Green, who I mentioned earlier, and Bob Jansen. And the dark dots and little octagons are places where they knew it bred, and the open ones are ones where they thought it bred. There isn't very much information on that map. You know, it's only to the county level. And they kind of, the dotted line there is kind of an area where they really were uncertain how far south it occurred. Well, just 12 years later, Bob Jansen updated all that information in his book, Birds of Minnesota. And a little bit more information, but still primarily a northern species. Didn't think it occurred in the Northeast, didn't think it occurred anywhere south of East Central Minnesota. So this is what we had up until doing the atlas. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So the same time that Jan and Bob wrote their books was in the 70s. And I'm guessing that most of you in the audience knew what was happening in the 70s, which was we were becoming a lot more environmentally conscious and a lot more interested in knowing and making sure that the development process also addressed conservation at the same time to bring them together. So there was a passage of a lot of environmental laws. And those laws really required us to have more precise information on the location of things. Again, if you're going to build something in Tower, Minnesota, knowing that a bird was in St. Louis County isn't very helpful. So what began at that time in the late 70s was what we call the atlasing phenomenon. And what that is the process of geographically cataloging the distribution and abundance of any element of biodiversity during a specific time period. And the process actually began in Great Britain in the 1950s, when botanists in Great Britain were really interested in getting much better information on the distribution of the flora in Great Britain. And so they divided the country into little squares, 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers, and tried to map, sent volunteers who knew plants out into those areas to map the distribution. That was published in the late 60s. And then the whole atlasing phenomena jumped across the pond and became the thing in northeastern United States with birders. It gave birders a purpose to go out and start mapping things. So really saw an evolution. And to the point that by the early 2000s, Minnesota was the only state along the Mississippi River who had not initiated an atlas for breeding birds. And that was important because we have a lot, as you know, of uncharted territory. And it's hard to get volunteers into some huge areas of northeastern Minnesota, particularly the peatlands. But There was a group that really felt committed to this process. They were successful in securing support from the Citizens Legislative Committee through the Environmental Trust Fund, which became our core source of funding during this project. And we launched Minnesota's first grading bird atlas. Field preparation began in 2008, and field work occurred over 5 breeding seasons from 2009 to 2013. Because remember, we're just looking for breeding birds. So a lot of these birds are migrants. Being out there in February is going to be very helpful. So it's a big state. How did we approach this? Well, you may know that Minnesota is divided into townships, and each of those townships are 36 square miles in size. What we did was, for each of those 36 square mile townships, we took the northeast quarter, which was 9 square miles, and designated that as a priority block for sampling. There's 9,700 total blocks in the state, and there's no way we were going to get data from all of those. So we just took a quarter of it, did it randomly, systematically throughout the state, and assigned volunteers to those priority blocks. So that's the priority block. There were 2,300 of those, so it was still not a small number out of the 9,700. And then we had volunteers who went out to those blocks. Now, people could survey wherever they wanted, but our task was to make sure that we got data from those priority blocks so that we had equal coverage on the state. And if you or I were to go out to one of those blocks, we could visit as many times as we want over that 5 years, and we would record everything we saw and heard in that block. And then there's very detailed instructions about assigning that detection as either an observed bird, a possible breeder, a probable breeder, or confirmed breeder. And the goal was to identify as many species as possible as confirmed breeder. Of course, the evidence was much stronger for confirmed, that you saw young, that you saw a nest with eggs, that you saw adult feeding young, whereas observed, you know, it just flew over, or you saw it once in a block. Does that make sense? Okay, so those were the instructions that people had. Our sampling effort was really pretty good. We had a total of over 380,000 evidence records from, say, 1 million detections of birds. And of the two, we had 250 species detected, and of those, we had confirmation of breeding for 231 species. How do these numbers compare? You know, if you don't have a sense of, well, how many birds do we have? It's a little hard to know, but if the number 250 is very similar to the number reported in neighboring states, 237 in Wisconsin, 233 in Michigan, and 199 in Iowa. Now, overall, we had 452 species recorded in Minnesota. A huge number of those are migrants that come through in the spring and fall. Fewer winter residents down in Canada, and even fewer are vagrants. They just kind of got lost in a storm. They're not going to hear, they're not establishing a breeding population or anything. So the 250 that we recorded as breeding species is a really good, solid number. The volunteers did a great job. Now, in terms of volunteers, it was a huge effort. We had more than 700 people contributed to the success of the atlas. And you don't have volunteers with having a coordinator. Our coordinator was Bonnie Sample, who kind of held everything together and made sure that those priority blocks were sampled, and we had people in the right place at the right time. And those people were really important in terms of really achieving confirmed nesting status for as many of those birds as possible. So let's go back and revisit our LeConte sparrow. The last most recent map that we saw was from Bob Jansen, where we had 3 counties mapped. This is the map from the Breeding Bird Atlas. Much more information at a much finer scale. You see it goes up into northeastern Minnesota as far as Lake County, and it's not just one record, it's several records there. And it goes much further south than people saw. But all the way along the Minnesota River, there's many records, and then quite a few right in central Minnesota. So, and as Roberts said, is most abundant not only in the Red River Valley, but also in the aspen parklands in northwestern Minnesota. So it's a much more complete picture of LeConte sparrow than ever before. Well, the real fun of the atlas was for those of us who are out in the field. It's so much fun to go out. People call atlasing birding with a purpose, because you weren't just looking for anything, but you're really trying to achieve information at a level that was really important for the atlas. So people were really committed to going and revisiting sites time after time. But once that was done in 2013, the hard work began because we had all that data to analyze. And we went through, actually it took us 4 years to kind of look through that, not only looking at the data, but Jerry and his graduate students did a lot of very complicated analysis that we're sharing. We literally looked at every single record. The purpose of an atlas is to get as good information as you can, but you can't always control what volunteers see. So it's really rare bird is reported in a really strange place. We really wanted to make sure that there was. So we did throw out some records. We did invalidate them just to make sure. It's a hard process. It's not a strict science about how you do that, but Jerry and I and Jan had to use our best judgment as to what really constituted a good record. Now, there are examples of really unusual species that were found. For example, a bufflehead duck, that we thought only nested up in Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge, was found down in south central Minnesota. But someone had a picture of it. So, but if someone had just said, yeah, I saw a bufflehead, we probably wouldn't have it. It's really unless they told us exactly what they saw, it would be hard to imagine that the bird would be nesting literally 400 miles away. So a lot of work went into developing atlas projects and products. And I'm just going to give you one example with the bobolink. So in addition to the map that I just showed you for the LeConte sparrow, we had one for every single species. The different colors, I'm not sure if you can see them well, but the different colors correspond with the different level of evidence. So if a block only has light green, it means it was only observed. If a block is colored very dark blue, it means it was confirmed breeder in that block. So we show all levels of evidence. And Jerry will talk about this in a minute, but we took that information, combined it with all sorts of information on landscape and topography and climate to do a predictive distribution map, which tells us species distribution. We also gathered information on habitat associations for each of the species. We did a statewide population estimate. In this case, the estimate for bobolinks is 6.5 million. That's pretty impressive. And then what we did that was done for 250 species. So it took a lot of time, and Jerry could talk about some of the complicated computer analysis that we did. It took a long time. So we actually launched all those results in November 2017 on a website. And that website is still up and running, mbirdatlas.org. And it's a great source of information. I think the book's even better. The website is really great. And there's a lot of opportunities to interact. We had a wonderful web designer who did I think, a really excellent job. What people don't understand sometimes is that it's really a static snapshot. We're not updating it. Because what this is a snapshot of Minnesota's breeding birds look like during a 5-year period, 2009 to 2013. Now, many states have already done a second atlas, more likely 20 years later. And I think even one state is on their third atlas now. So our hope is that this really sets a foundation for repeating the work for 20 years and seeing how things like climate change really impact the distribution of our birds. So this is not a continually updated site, but it's great for a snapshot. Well, as sometimes we thought we were a little crazy, we thought, oh, we've done all this work on the website, it'd be easy to do a book. Let me tell you the answers. But we really, there's a lot of debate about whether or not everything should be on the web, or do people miss having books, or do they really like books, or they don't read books anymore, and we went back and forth on that. And what we learned during this project is that websites aren't forever. We found some critical information that we're using under publications that was not very time book. We actually had to contact people to archive. So the web is a little tricky. Books are forever. And we really decided that was the way to go in the end. Because people often ask us and say, oh, we got the web, we don't need the book. But as committed as we are, and the university is, to keep that website up, I think the book is more important. So we really wanted to write a book to provide, because the web went public in 2017. We finished the book last year. Throughout 2017, through the next 7 years, we were providing and compiling the most up-to-date information. So it's even more up-to-date.
Just encouraging you to get closer to the mic.
Oh, yes, thank you. So we really updated. What we have in the book is detailed information about distributional changes from the late 1700s, when explorers were going through this and made many comments about the distribution birds, to the early 1800s. All that. We wanted to share the wealth of new data that was available on birds, and really try to expand the readership by including a lot of information that we thought appealed to a broader, more general audience. And as I mentioned, books last forever. Websites, our experiences, they don't. So just briefly, we did 3 manuscripts between 2018 and 2021. Copy editing and page design took 2 years, and then the final printing was last year. So it basically took us another 6 years to do what we thought was just a little task. And of the 250 species that are in the book, most of them have a 2-page layout with a ton of information, but there are about 30 species that we thought were really special in Minnesota. Many of the game birds, winged warbler, which has the highest population than anywhere else in the world. So we picked a number of species, about 30, that have a 4-page layout that we really had a ton of information for. So what we want to do now is just give you a sample of some of the highlights in the book. There's a ton of background information. I won't go into all that, but a lot of information about bird associations with different habitats. But the heart of the book are the 250 species accounts. And for each species, we have a summary of its life history. We have an introduction to the species that I'll talk about in a minute. We have all the information we could gather on its breeding distribution, going back when we could to the 1700s and 1800s. And anything that's been published since then up to late 2023 is in the book. That includes historical counts, information with the point counts, and predicted distribution maps that we'll talk about in a minute. We also have critical information on breeding habitat that's specific to Minnesota, because a lot of these birds use different habitats in different parts of their range. We have information on population abundance and population trends. And then we have several paragraphs on conservation. We're just going to highlight the ones that are in pink this morning. We could be up here forever, and we don't want to take you too long. But one of the things we really wanted to do was add the introduction to each species, because in the 1800s, certainly in the 1700s, people, field naturalists, didn't have cameras, they didn't have binoculars, they didn't have spotting scopes. They had their language to describe these birds. And I tell you, the language they use to describe some of these birds is so beautiful. And we really wanted to convey in the introduction just how beautiful these birds are and how special they are. So we talk about some things consistently, like their songs, their plumage, but also how people kind of view those species and how important they are to us. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. T.S. Roberts, who I mentioned before, when he wrote about the grasshopper sparrow, which is another one of those little brown jobs, as people know, very small, indistinct bird with a very difficult song that's really thin. He wrote, "The song is so thin and weak that even the grasshopper after which he is named might be ashamed to have it coming from its fiddle." Jerry and I couldn't have thought that up in a million years. Leopold, when he was writing the Sandhill Crane and its evolutionary history, which dates back at least 10 million years, wrote, "When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. We hear the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution." I mean, that just conveys the sense of that bird and what you hear. It's just so beautiful. So we try to include as much of that as possible. Then we go, after the life history and the introduction, excuse me, we go into all the data that we have on the species, all the background data, which helps us place the data that we got from the atlas in context. So what have we known about the bird over the years, and how has it changed over the years? And then we talk about the BBA atlas data. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Jerry, who's going to talk about the point counts, and we're going to switch microphones here briefly. It's really it's very hard to put on. Well, you need them both. Yeah. We keep thinking we're breaking it, and it's just
We're gonna get new. May I?
Please.
there you go. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Lee. I'd just say one thing, when I started working together, it's almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And you would believe what it was about. It was on a 31st data gathering for the copper nickel mining in your area. In 1976, we worked all summer long in the Babbitt, Ely, Isabella area gathering data on birds. I was formerly director of the Center for Water and the Environment at the Natural Resources Research Institute as well. And we did that job for 20 years in addition to my professor appointment. And I've been to, Ely is one of my favorite cities. I love it here. I've had at least over 50 trips to the Boundary Waters. So it's really one of my favorite places. So again, we think there's a rare opportunity for gathering data. So we use point counts, something I've been using in detail for at least several decades now. And we want to really take advantage of that information we have to do a couple of things. We got a lot of data from places, but it's still a measly sampling of the real estate. I mean, we can't hit every single part of the world, but we want to fill in the blanks now with the modeling of this information. And then, so I want to talk a bit more about the point counts, because it really complemented all the volunteer data. The volunteer data was essential for confirmation. Point counts is not getting us information on confirmed breeding, because we don't spend enough time there to do the looking around for nests. But we got a problem. I'll throw these two maps up here right away. So these are results for Canada goose. On the map on the left shows all the data from volunteers and from our point counts. And you'll notice there's some really dark areas here because this map is extremely biased on the left. So if I tried to write up this work and analyze it, my fellow biologists and my statisticians especially would just rip me apart. So you can't do that because you've got too much information from the Twin Cities area, too much around Brainerd, not enough from Ely, for example, so it doesn't balance out. So we want to spread that sampling out. And so on the right are the data from our point counts. We still recorded Canada geese, but it's all systematically gathered because you have to spend the same amount of time, count the same amount of area, et cetera, in order to put all those points together. And that's what we did. But I want to tell you about point counts. Usually people are really interested in this or intrigued by it at least. This is basically 10 minutes. We know exactly where we want to go from a GPS. It tells us we want to go to this spot. We've got our GPS. We go to that spot. We do a 10-minute count, but it's all during prime time. Now, and our goal was to count in all 2,352 townships in the state of Minnesota. That was the goal, to get to every one of them. We got to over 98% of them. Just so I don't forget to tell you that. This is one of my former grad students, Carol Carter. So you have to do something to be able to work for me on this project. You have to pass a test of 86 bird songs. You have to achieve Pretty high score on them. Not, you don't have to get it perfect, but damn close. Your hearing has to be in normal ranges. I don't qualify anymore. I'm too old. I can't hear. I got hearing aids, so I don't qualify to actually census anymore. But we had audiologists tell us what are the normal ranges that they should be able to hear in. And we had to do a field camp to make sure everybody's gathering the data in the same way. So we do that for about a 3-day period or so. We do distance estimation, how far the bird is away approximately, but we don't try to say it's 34 meters away or it's 86 meters away. They're in bands of 0 to 25 meters, 25 to 50, things of that sort. So bands, but this makes a big difference for population estimates. You want to know how many are closer to you and how many are farther away. That way. So how do we go about sampling those townships? This is just an example, in which we did every single township was a randomly sampled point, which, for example, in this example here, PO up there, it fell right in the middle of the lake. Well, we had the GPS set us up, so we didn't sample any interstates, we didn't sample any US highways, we sampled just secondary roads. So if that random point was there, we went to the closest road, secondary road to that. And that's the first place we sampled in the township, 10-minute point count. Then we sampled the primary and secondary habitats, most abundant ones in the township. And those are 3 points that we gather in every township. And as I said, we hit over 98% of those 2,352. I had 2 people that gathered these data in the boundary waters. It was Katie, let's see, it was Ed Zalanis and Katie, and they ended up getting married later on. They sampled the whole area themselves. Wonderful job. They just loved what they did. They spent over that about 3 or 4 year period, they sampled the entire boundary waters. Not on roads, of course, they were doing it off portages and things of that sort. But the same way we gathered all the data. This is a fancy diagram of very sophisticated work we've done, but I'll just go through it fairly quickly. We wanted to model as much information about where those birds were at. So we used the newer wall-to-wall coverage from Minnesota of land cover. We included disturbance variables like logging, forest fire, insects. We have distributional data for all of them, landscape features, and 6 variables associated with climate. And we analyze that 3 different spatial scales. Small scale, where most of the songbirds are to be found at small scales, but if you got a raptor or a sandhill crane you're dealing with, you want a large scale. One of the complications I ran into right away when we were doing the analysis is we have 58 independent variables. A species like the red-eyed vireo has 5,971 observations or samples. Well, when a guy went out to analyze that data, he came back after a week or 2 and he says, Jerry, that model is still running on his PC. And I go, I got over 100 species we got to analyze. And I said, what are we going to do? Well, fortunately, I'm a professor. I got free money, free use of Minnesota supercomputer. We set that up. And that solved our problem. Within a few weeks, we could analyze all the data we had. So it was really important. And there's a citation for a publication that shows we've done this and we published the work in the peer-reviewed literature. So just a couple examples. So basically using that information to make projections about where the species are and something about their distribution. This is an example of the white-throated sparrow. And of course, you know that species quite well, very common up in your area here. And we have a good handle on the density of those species as well. Expressed as units per 100 acres, for example, in this map. There's a tree swallow, just an example of that one also. Found mostly in this ecotone between the forested areas in the northeast and the open areas in the western, southern portions of the state. And so we have a good prediction map of where those species occur also. And then the black tern, different kind of species, it's a little bit more difficult to monitor. So we just express its distribution in terms of land cover suitability. And all the species we have are either one of these kinds of expressions of their distribution in the state. I gotta show you this one. If you've ever been to Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge, that's area up there. It's a fantastic place to go to. Almost as good as northeastern Minnesota. And I really give credit to the two people that did all the modeling. There was Ed Zalanis, one of my graduate students, and who's now working on waterfowl for Minnesota DNR over in Bemidji, and Nick Wallen did all of that modeling work. So what does it get us? One thing it gets us is tells us where some really important habitats are. And this area up here, this is the Red Lake peatland in northwestern Minnesota, but it has a lot of two species that are critical in Minnesota. The Connecticut warbler, and you can see the distribution map of that species up in that region. That's where the Connecticut warblers are. I call the Connecticut warbler the species I'm most concerned about in terms of its population trend. It is declining more than any species in the state of Minnesota right now. And by the way, it has nothing to do with Connecticut. And that's really a bad name for that species. It was described probably, back in the 1800s. That said somebody found it migrating through Connecticut. So I said, oh, we're going to call it a Connecticut warbler. It's really a black spruce tamarack associated warbler, but it's really in decline. Another one that's found up there primarily, all-sided flycatcher. You see its primary distributions in this region. This is also a species of conservation concern in Minnesota. And you have a few of them up in this portion of Minnesota. Oh, how did that end up there?
I wonder.
We'll skip that one. We're going to take that one out.
Oh, we're going to take these out. Oh, I used the wrong.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to take these two out, just in the interest of time.
In just the time.
We took them out this morning, and I thought. And so we use these the point counts. I should say just a little more about point counts. You wouldn't believe in a prime time in June or late May to June, you're sampling early in the morning. We only sample between about 4:45 and up maybe as late as 9:30. If you go out in one spot in 10-minute point count, on average, a good observer can identify about 15 species on average in that time. Sometimes there's as many as 25. A few times it's really a poor habitat, maybe only 5 or 6, but most of the time you can pick up an amazing number of birds by a qualified observer in that structure. So one of the ways the populations have been done is by roadside counts done all over by thousands of people in North America, which are shown on the left. On the right-hand side are the roadside counts done by volunteers in Minnesota. There are a total of 84 of those. They're all done every year. And so that's where the estimates come from. These are 3-minute counts that they do, roadside counts, but there's 50 of them that they do along the roads. So here we have it again, 84 routes, an average of 70 samples per year with 50 stops. So what their estimate is about 3,500 sample points. So what do we have? These are the places we sampled. There are about 9,100 10-minute point counts we got. Yeah, over 98% samples. You'll see a few places, especially north of Red Lake, where we actually had a fancy device from DNR to go and sample out there, but it was really difficult. That's some of the places where we missed getting out to those areas. It's really heavily water area. There's no way to access these places. I had some money in for helicopters, but I never used it. I thought it was going to be too expensive. I paid for people instead of helicopters. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. So one reason we have higher estimates of the population in Minnesota is because we've sampled roadless areas. Those roadside counts didn't sample any of those kind of places. They didn't go into the boundary waters. There are no roads there. Red Lake peatlands, same situation with no roads. We have much higher population estimates, and for certain species, they're much more abundant in those places. We have better coverage statewide than the roadside counts did, and we're doing a little different modeling technique than they used, but they're evolving towards some of the things that we're doing today. Just a couple of examples. So the statewide estimate from previous analyses have shown that this estimate of about 1.6 million breeding birds in the state of Minnesota. Ours are a lot higher, 4.75 million for the sedgerin. The highest density of sedgerins anywhere in the continent of the United States is in Minnesota. They know that too. That's their results, but we know there's a lot more of them than what had been projected before. How about Baltimore Oriole? In the databases that they have nationally, they estimate 470,000 Baltimore Orioles, adults in the population. We estimate 3.2 million. So this is really quite a substantial change. Now there's an interesting question from this work. Uh-oh. What are the most abundant birds in Minnesota? So this is from our work. We have a lot more information they've had. Here's the winner. This is what we were calling the most abundant bird in the state of Minnesota. And I'm challenging anybody to prove me wrong on this one. And many of you probably don't know it, but it's a very common species up here. It's in wetlands it's in a variety of shrubby areas, etc. And you can count a lot of them in 10-minute point count. The second most abundant bird in the state of Minnesota, horned lark, very common of the agricultural region, and we have a lot of agricultural open habitats. Song sparrow, 10.4 million. So the whole list is here, the first top 10 at least. Common yellow throat, you see, and some of these are pretty common. You'll know, red-winged blackbird doesn't surprise you. Nashville warbler is one of your most abundant birds in this region. What are the most common birds? Now there's a difference between abundance and common. What bird would you most frequently encounter at any one point? And the winner of that is this one. You know, you can be out in the middle of the wilderness out there and there might be a robin there. It's amazing that they're all over. 59% of the random points we gathered had robins on them. So they're doing extremely well. And common yellowthroat was the second. Red and blackbird. And this is a complete list. So in the interest of time, because she's standing right behind me here, I'll move on. And what about the most abundant birds in northeast Minnesota? So we kind of regionalize it here a little bit. I'll just go through this really quickly. You might be surprised at all these. American redstart, red-eyed vireo, chestnut-sided warbler, black and white warbler. So if we just looked at just the birds of northeastern Minnesota, these are the species. They're all insectivores. And they're eating insects. That's a good thing, by the way. What are some of the species restricted to northeastern Minnesota? There are a lot of those too. Many of these species, again, if you don't know some of the smaller birds, you don't probably realize it, but these are ones that are primarily found in northeastern Minnesota. And they're all just beautiful too. And again, every one of these species is eating insects in the summertime while they're here. And what are the rarest birds that we found during this work? Burrowing owl, white-eyed vireo, yellow-throated warbler, and lark munting. We only recorded one of each of those over that 5-year period. So I'm summarizing. So, so what we in the book we have about 30 bullets. We talked about what did we really learn from this Atlas project. there's many species that are really, really in trouble. And black-crowned night heron, piping plover, loggerhead shrike, and cerulean warbler are among those species that are really in dire straits. Species of native prairies. We've lost over 98% of the Minnesota's native prairies. They're also in big time trouble. And a couple examples are grasshopper sparrow and chestnut-collared longspur. Decline of several secretive species, nocturnal species like eastern whippoorwill, eastern screech owl. We know they decline, but those species are really, really difficult to monitor. They sing at dusk periods or at night, but we know they're not doing as well as they've done in the past when we look at what T.S. Roberts had to say about them. But all is not bad. I can say some really good stories, and you know about them probably. Conservation efforts do work. Bald eagle, they're dime a dozen now, aren't they? It seems they're everywhere. Peregrine falcon, osprey, trumpeter swan. Trumpeter swan, my gosh, that is just an amazing story. So there's some good stories out there as well. Continuing range expansion, wild turkey, sandhill cranes. I mean, wild turkeys. I grew up in Duluth, and you never see a wild turkey there. Now they're north of Duluth, and lots of them. Red-bellied woodpeckers all the way to the Canadian border now. And sandhill cranes, again, also doing well. And we had a few examples of, most of the birds seem to be moving more north, but there are some examples of southern movements. It's common loon as showing some southern movements into those regions, northern harrier and clay-colored sparrow moving farther into the southern regions. So this is what we look like, I guess, when we finished up with this work. And they're just some of the highlights of this work. I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of things. So this is the first time that we've had an assessment of all the breeding birds we have in the state of Minnesota, about 250 of them, and we have it at a very fine scale now. We hope that they're going to be guiding efforts in conservation into the 21st century, and insights on our birds and how they've changed over the years. We go back a lot farther than most states do it in Minnesota. So I do want to just quickly go through some of the people and groups that have been really important, because Lee and I and Jan didn't do this by ourselves. There were lots of people that contributed to it, and especially donors. In the front page of the book, we have all those places listed. Wilson and Taylor is a California company that did the layout. They did a fantastic job. All the photographers in that book, photos, they didn't charge us anything. They got a free book, and they're almost all Minnesota photographers. 99% of them are Minnesota photographers. And there's a huge amount of volunteer efforts here. Gary over here, my wife is in the back here, and John Green. They're the ones that really suffered too, all the work that Lee and I put into it. And the volunteers and surveyors, 700 people out there gathering data, they weren't being paid. Audubon, Minnesota ran the project. They got the money from LCCMR, and Mark Martell deserves a huge amount of credit for putting this together. Rob Schultz and the people running the state office there. And I got to say, the climate change analysis was done by some really powerful people, very sophisticated analysis. And it's on its website here. If you want to look at details of climate change, they did a fantastic job. And that's what's presented in the book, but not on the website, by the way. And books available, local bookstores, University of Minnesota Press, you can get online and get it that way, or it's available actually today.
Yeah.
So, thank you.